Hello, welcome back to the It's Karate Time mix walkthrough. In the previous episodes, we looked at the orchestra, percussion, and drums. Now, in this episode, we're going to look at bass and guitars. So I have two guitar stems and one bass stem. These two guitar stems, sometimes I'll split out electrics or acoustics, or a lot of times, I think guitar one will be rhythm guitars, and then all the solos and leads will be on stem two. But as usual, or similar to a lot of my other stems, they have very similar processing. So I can processing and effects, so I can kind of move them back and forth. So here's what's going on in the stringed land. Live bass, some synth basses. So they're actually, the bass stem. It's not just the electric bass. I sometimes put some of these groovy synth basses from Zach and Leo's sequencers in here. Guitars, these are all live guitars. All the guitars and bass were played by the magnificent Andrew Sinowak, who's a session guitar player here in Los Angeles. So we have a stereo pair, double-tracked pair of rhythm guitars. Looks like we added some eighths here. Similar thing at the end. And then there are a number of leads going on here. And then Myron did a solo as well later on. It looks like we actually blended solos here. But we did some editing here. We took things out. A lot of that was done with Zach and Leo here with me, just kind of trying different things. Some of the sections weren't quite working, so some elements we muted at places, some we featured, so on and so forth. But anyhow, let's listen to starting with bass. So here's the live bass. With no processing, though, I didn't do a ton. Oh, actually, that did have these plugins still on. There's the dry bass. So Andrew gave me a microphone recorded on his amp, or actually maybe it's an output. I'm not sure actually what that has. And then the DI directly. That's pretty typical for bass. I always like to have the DI and the amp separately and usually blend them. Sometimes we'll use one or the other. They have very different colors. We'll hear the amp here versus the DI. The DI is a very clean sort of scoopy sound. Then the amp has a lot of the mid-range. So together, they're a nice blend. They're really featuring on the amp on this one. Did a little EQ. Looks like it just was a little heavy in the mix. So a little balance. Again, that warmth sounded really nice on its own, but in the mix, obviously, just needed to clear up a little bit of low mid-range. Those are bussed together to a mono bus here where all of my global bass processing is. Starting with this Helios EQ. Looks like I upgraded to the new one here. Does sound a little bit better. Looks nicer. Looks like I'm boosting a little bit of 1.4 because the peak is on. So just adding a little bit of, bite to things. And then boosting a shelf in the low end below 60. And I think that's all. Yeah, that's all I'm doing here. So it's just, just a little bit of broad, nice sounding EQ. So yeah, not doing a ton, but I like how it sounds. Then the Pro Q, again, it was just getting a little heavy, so I EQ'd some low mids out. Just sat in the mix better. And then finally, I do love the Fairchild. It's not my only bass EQ, but it's kind of my go-to bass EQ. Sometimes I use the DBX 160, sometimes the TLM 100. There's a number of good options, but this is usually what I try first. Number 2 in the time constant, and then we'll see. I don't think it's getting a ton of gain reduction, but a decent amount. Oh, not much. Maybe more here. Yeah. So not usually more than 2 or 3 decibels of gain reduction. Sometimes I'll compress bass a lot, or if I'm doing more of a pop rock kind of track, I might compress bass a lot. In this case, it was just adding a little, just sort of evening things out a bit. I am using on the, looks like on a lot of bass elements here, this micro shift, which is turned way down. It's negative 15. But I started with fat wide pads as a good preset, and then I just tweaked it. I slide this focus knob until things sound as wide as possible. Sometimes I'll insert this on things to get a little more width. Looks like that's what I did on Mecha Bass 1 here. Yep, it's also fat wide pads, almost the exact same settings. Just obviously the blend is turned down, so you get some of the dry signal in there. Yeah, let's hear what that sounds like on bass. So that's the obvious effect, which is kind of cool. It's a kind of a, vibey vintage old bass sound. It just really adds a lot of width. But I didn't need that much signal. It's a very subtle effect, but just gives the bass a little more movement in the mix, a little more width, and helps it kind of just, spread around a bit more. Sometimes, again, I'll turn that up like other things in certain cues, but in this case, it's at my template level of -15. So we also have some synth basses in here, which are all kind of part of the low end of this track. A lot of these are just ARPs or, things that are programmed like this. Now, if I had an extra synth stem open, sometimes I maybe would put that on a synth ARP stem. In this case, there's a ton of other synths going on, so I was like, let's just keep all the low synth and the bass guitar kind of on a bass stem, so the dub just has kind of control over all the low-end melodic elements. So they're playing the same notes. And then later on here, we get a little more. This is part of the Terminator section I was talking about. This is just sort of this mecha bass thing, which is cool. And this one I did add a lot of width on this one. So this is really an overuse of this micro shift, just because in the mix I just thought this was a little too mono-y. There's a lot of elements going on, so I kind of questioned. I was like, do I really need this element to be wide? But I kind of liked it to have that space, though I only did it on one of them. I could have done this on both mecha basses, but just number one, I added some width. I guess we can turn on all these EQs too. Same thing as a lot of other stuff, just sort of, evening out low end. Nothing's more than 3 or 4 dB, usually less than that. This one's 4.6. Typically I try to keep my EQs not too heavy-handed. And when I'm EQing too, when I'm initially saying these cuts, a lot of times I'll pull it down and then, okay, that sounds better. That's, I sort of sweep around and find by ear where I want the frequency to be. And then just pull back a little bit. Just go up a dB maybe, or half a dB, and then find sort of a happy medium. Sometimes not. Sometimes like, no, I really want to cut it a lot. But, that's all part of the mixing process, is doing something, listening to it, sort of questioning whether or not it needs to be done, and then making a decision. Finally, we also have this, So those, all kind of serve as the bass element. So I was okay kind of summing these all together in one stem. Bus-wise, I did nothing because most of my, the compression and things like that I just do on the bass guitar. Looks like I did absolutely nothing on the bus here. So that's just chilling. That's the basses. Let's move on to rhythm guitars. So this is, as you can see, this rhythm guitar is playing almost the entire cue, except for this middle section. We decided to cut it out, but this is a major element of the sort of band. Let's mute the bass for now. So nice wide guitars. Double tracked, but as you can hear, it's a little bit present in the mid range. It maybe sounds a little, a little bit heavy in the mids, a little bit heavy in the lows. It sounds nice on its own, but this is typical of guitars. So let's add in my processing here, which is the 1081 is my go-to guitar EQ. Pull back some 560, pull back a little 330, clean up the lows, and then just boost it a little bit of shelf at 10K. It's like 2 notches up. Don't want to add too much high end, but it really helps those guitars to cut through. And then Kramer Pi I love on rhythm guitars. So this is just sort of my typical guitar compressor for rhythm guitars. You'll see some of the leads I use the LA3A like on my Roan here, but for most guitars, Kramer Pi. Excuse me. Let's add those in. So yeah, now it sounds like bitey rock guitars. And then not insane amount, but a decent amount of compression as well. on those, and I think everything's probably about the same. Yeah, that I just copied over. Yep, all these are exactly the same on these other guitar parts. I copied it over, it sounded good, and I moved on. So there's also this part going on. So given that it's a rhythm guitar, I put it on guitar 1 because that's all this stem is going to be. You know, those all kind of serve as one element, one rhythm guitar element. And a similar thing going on here. With processing. Rhythm guitars, I don't want them too wet, obviously. You know, these are supposed to be kind of very dry, up-in-your-face guitar sounds. But I do like to use this, what is it, Whistle Lured, which is a really tight, small studio that I've EQ'd quite heavily, just to give it a little bit of space. You know, if I was recording guitars at a studio, I'd probably be putting room mics up. I'd put the amp inside. Maybe, you know, I'd maybe have some gobos around it so that the close mics on the amp are quite dry. But then it's nice to have sometimes room on guitars, just a little bit, to give them some space, just so that they're not, you know, totally existing in this dead, dry, you know, production world. I like to add space to things just to sort of worldize them as you may. So let's hear what that sounds like with a little bit of room. You hear very short, very tight sound, just adding a little bit of space. So that's all I use on the rhythm guitars. I did also no EQ, I believe. Yeah, the bus EQ is totally blank. Just because I liked the way it looks. I'm going to unmute all these other effects that I didn't end up using and mute that folder. Then we're on to the leads. So we got kind of crazy leads going on down here. We have 2 tracks of Andrew and Myron, eventually 3 tracks of Andrew, playing some harmonies and whatnot. A little more effects going on here. But similar, I did you know, some EQ going on here. Looks like maybe I did a little bit of tuning on Myron for something. 1081 here, a little EQ, a little extra EQ, just to sort of clear up some high mids, then compression on all of that. For these leads, though, you know, here we have 2 Andrew leads, and, you know, they were recorded for the exact same. I think this is just the output of a, you know, sort of effects rack or effects something going on, just going direct into, I don't have a D. Well, I do have a DI, but I don't need to use it because it wasn't recorded through an amp. It was recorded through just an effects chain of some kind that Andrew does. But when there's 2 parts, obviously they're right on top of each other. So something I do here as well, which I'll show you once I turn on plugins. So I like to use this S1 on stereo tracks just to tilt things one side or the other. So instead of doing it with the pan knobs, which I think is a little too drastic, it sounds weird to have, in my opinion. Sometimes I'll use the pan knobs, but a lot of times it just sounds kind of awkward. Like you can hear where the other panned in channel is. I instead like to use this S1 just to sort of tilt things instead. So they stay wide in both channels, but then the signal just sort of, you know, shifts over to one side or the other. So let's take a listen to these leads. Okay, that's what that sounds like dry. We'll add in some plugins. EQ. You know, not nearly as much going on. I didn't cut. Well, I cut different frequencies and did no high-end boost because the high-end was getting a little harsh on these. I guess I EQ'd them slightly differently, it looks like. But there's the EQ. Add some compression. Nothing too crazy. Now let's do that S1 imager. So if you're listening on headphones or sitting in the good position with a pair of studio monitors, you could probably hear that flip them out. You could really, without changing the level, you get a lot more definition between the parts just by having that little bit of panning going on. So this is going on there. Let's add the effects just on this to show you what's going on. I'm using a lot more. These are all pretty much the same settings as over here on the guitar one stem. Actually, it's different. Surprises I find months later in my sessions. So yeah, I guess cello is the room that I use there. Sometimes it's nice to use two different rooms just to kind of give things different space. It helps give, depth to your mixes, is, putting things in different spaces and different amounts of reverbs. I guess for this one I use cello, so that's what the lead room is. I am using this Valhalla Vintage Verm 2.1, not super long, but definitely longer than anything I'd put on rhythm guitars, and I definitely use it on here on these leads. And then sometimes I get shot down by Zach and Leah with my delays, because as you could hear, there was delay already from Andrew on his effects chain here. But I love this Korg, STD 3000. This is the classic edge delay that was used on Streets with No Name and all those kind of old 80s productions. This was a hugely revolutionary delay unit when it came out in the 80s, and it just, I don't know, an eighth dotted delay just sounds great on leads. Though I used very little bit of it. I think I'm sending like -20, so it's just a little bit of delay going on. And then I like to take delays, I like to feed them into one of my longer reverbs, which I did here, feeding it into that Valhalla Vintage Verb. So let's turn those on while this is going on. Here's the room. That's actually, that's adding a decent amount of space. It kind of just, widened things a bit. And here's my long reverb. So honestly, kind of sounds longer than 2 seconds. It's one of those reverbs that, even though it's only 2 seconds, it feels like the tail goes a little bit longer than that. So that's just a little extra reverb, though I think there was a little bit from Andrew. Then finally, let's add in the delay. See if we can get that delay. Yeah. So pretty subtle. Not much of that going on. Sometimes if I use too much delay on guitars, I get shot down and I have to turn it down or turn it off. But that's the effects that I'm using. Later on, like I said, there is this third lead that comes on at the very end. Let's just turn everything on there and hear what that sounds like. Yeah, it's just some extra harmony going on there. Finally, then, we have Myron, which is some epic guitar solos going on through a lot of this. Here's what that sounds like, mostly dry. So it sounds pretty good overall. There's effects printed on there. It kind of already sounds the way it does. This Melodyne, probably, I think it's just like one little phrase we just wanted to tune a little bit. I think maybe it was a conflict with the orchestra, but, there it is, Melodyne. So that's just for the very end there. Otherwise, most of it's untuned. Did do some EQ here. Very similar to the other ones, just a little bit of mid-range clearing. Let's hear what that sounds like. Yeah, stands out a little bit more brightness. Then I just wanted to get a little bit more surgical with the high-end cuts. I think when this solo at times is very loud in the mix, it was just getting a little bit harsh, so I just wanted to pull back a little bit, 2 dB, 0.85 dB here, just, a little bit of harshness reduction. Still a bright sound, but not as piercing. And then finally, I do love the LA3A on leads. So not doing a ton, just kind of evening things out. And then I use the same effects that I was using on Andrew. Let's turn all of those on. Oops. So kind of similar effects as what's going on in on whatever processing he had going on there, but just a little bit more of my own, adds a little bit of space, blends well with Andrew at the end there. Yeah, that's what is going on in the bass and guitar land of this cue. So stay tuned next for keyboards and synths. and a little bit of shakuhachi as well. And then in the final episode after that, we'll take a listen to the whole thing and compare it to the reference mix. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.